Good afternoon, everyone. 大家下午好，欢迎来到耶鲁北京中心。Welcome to the Yale Center Beijing. This is Yale University's home here in China. And actually, there are also captions in case you need it. I'm just going to do this opening and introduction for the benefit of Professor Jonathan Feinstein, who's visiting from New Haven. I am Carol Lee Rafferty. I'm a Yale College graduate and also the executive director for Yale Center Beijing. Today, we're in for a fascinating and very timely talk about Professor Jonathan Feinstein's new book, Creativity in Large-Scale Contexts. Professor Jonathan Feinstein is a professor at the Yale School of Management and previously taught at the Stanford Graduate School of Business as well. I actually just learned from him today that he grew up in Silicon Valley. So really, he has the DNA to be talking about creativity in large-scale contexts. For those of you who signed up for this talk, you may already know that his work and this book is about how to be systematic about creativity innovation and innovation in large organizations and how this is more a long unfolding process rather than just a spark. And I just can't wait to hear more from him. A little bit about his background. He grew up in California in Silicon Valley and went to Stanford as an undergrad and MIT as a PhD. Without further ado, we're just so delighted to have Professor Feinstein here. And I know that, it's a beautiful Sunday out there. We'll have people keep on coming in as we go. But I, like all of you, am very much looking forward to this talk. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Carol, for that very kind and generous introduction. And it's really my honor to be at the Yale Center Beijing and to be visiting Beijing, your beautiful country, for a few days here. So thank you so much for inviting me to come and talk to you all. I'm going to be talking about creativity and innovation today. I'll talk for about 45 minutes or so, and then we'll have plenty of time for some questions and discussion, which is always very exciting with this topic, I think. So I have my own perspective on creativity, which comes out of many years of research and scholarship and thinking and studying and interviewing and talking to lots of people engaged in creativity and innovative work in lots of different fields. And so I'm really here to tell you this perspective, and I think it's one that does challenge a lot of more conventional ways of thinking about how creativity and innovation happen. I think that makes it very important for us to develop a better understanding of what is actually involved in this process and how everybody can participate and be creative to the most of their ability. So that's really what this is about. How does creativity happen, right? You might be asking that question. I think that there's a common view, certainly in my country, but I think around the world, really, that creativity just strikes suddenly. Maybe it's even a little bit random, and it's really just some people we call creative geniuses who get to be creative. I put up two images there. If you looked on something like Google or a search engine under the word creativity, one of the top images that will come up is a light bulb. Because the idea is you just turn on the light and then, wow, creativity's there. In an earlier time, a different culture perspective would be it's like a lightning bolt that suddenly just hits you and then you get to be creative. That's a standard view, but that's not really what's happening with creativity. Or another way to say that is that's just a small part of the overall picture of what someone is doing or an organization is doing when they're able to be creative. And it's also not a very useful way of thinking about it, because what are you going to do? Just sit around and wait until a lightning bolt hits you in the head? You could, but that's not really what creative people actually do. It turns out creative people work for a long time. And so actually, creativity comes about through a longer term process. And I'm going to share with you some stories today of some people who are viewed as successful in their creative work to give you some idea of what those paths or unfolding process could look like. My perspective is anyone can engage in creative and innovative activity. Every single person can. And it's really about them understanding the process. Sometimes it's about gaining a little confidence. Sometimes it's about the fact that there are some blockages and how do they remove the blockages to be able to be more creative. We'll talk about some of that today. You can also certainly feel free to discuss or ask questions afterwards. The other perspective I have being in a school of management is it's really about managing the process. And if you ask me what is the first thing I would say to an organization who's thinking about trying to improve creativity and innovation, step number one, recognize that it is a process, and then think about more deliberately, how do you manage that process? And a lot of organizations still in the world today do not do that. And the result is they're very random about creativity. They're not getting nearly as much creative, innovative flow as they probably could be getting if they were just approaching it a little more systematically that way. So that's what we're here to talk about. And just to complete that piece of this story, the dramatic moments do happen. I'm sure they happen because I've talked to so many creative people. We hear their own accounts and we know that they happen. But that they're happening in the context of this bigger world of an unfolding process. And if you want to manage creativity, you want to start by thinking about the big process. And then you'll see how those moments happen in that bigger context. Okay. Well, how does creativity happen? I just told you some of the ways it doesn't happen. How does it happen? Where does it happen? Well, it certainly happens in our brains. At least that'd be one logical way to think about that. But what is actually in your brain, right? What is it that is enabling you to be creative? For someone to have an idea or have an insight or perceive an opportunity more clearly. It's also about recognizing opportunities in the world. Yes, that's absolutely a big part of creativity and innovation. I did grow up in the Silicon Valley area, in the San Francisco Bay Area, and I've been very fortunate to know so many very creative people who are willing to tap into their creativity, and so much of it is about the opportunity that somebody recognizes and takes. But how does somebody come to recognize that opportunity, right? It's a question. Well, something I've realized as I worked on this over time, creativity happens in large-scale network contexts. That'd be one way to think about this that you might not have thought of before. So it's a good way to think about it. What do I mean by network? And don't worry, we're not gonna overdo the network math in this talk, which would not be smart. But we are gonna just touch on what that means and how someone's able to use their network to be creative. There's networks of people, social network. I think we all understand that today with social media. There's networks of things, of places, of events, and certainly of ideas or concepts that we all have in our minds that are structured together. What is your context, your large-scale context? Well, really, it's everything you have experienced and that you know. It's really your whole field that you're learning about in your culture. So it's a lot. Okay, so the first thing to understand is the context of somebody, a writer, an inventor, in which they create, it's actually a lot because they've gone through their life learning things. And they've got all these concepts and people, and really they're trying to find their way to something creative in that context that they live in. So we'll talk about that a little bit. I'll give you some examples. Here's just one example of a context, a very simple diagram to get a little feeling. This is the context for the writer Virginia Woolf. The actual context would be much larger than this, but here's just like an overview of it. Thinking about her context, there was her reading world, and this is someone who was a very, very intensive reader. By the time she developed the key concept that I'll share with you later on today, she had read, by my own calculations, at least several thousand books, minimum, several thousand books. Her father actually was a Victorian scholar, and he had a large library, and a lot of her reading up till at least the age of 20 was actually books from her father's library. So we know something about what she read. She's also somebody who made her living for a lot of her adult life as basically writing book reviews for London newspapers. So they would send her a book, she'd write the review. Became a very, very good reader, a very critical reader by doing that. But we know from that, just the huge numbers of books that she read. She'd write a book review, sometimes about an author like Charles Dickens, and she'd read every single novel that author had written. So she'd read a lot. And I broke that down here on that picture into literature, books she read. And there would be time periods. She loved actually the older Shakespeare time period, but also knew a lot about her own time period, different cultures. Although she read a lot of English, she also read a tremendous amount of other literatures worldwide. Authors she read, and then, of course, the works that she read, and there'd be thousands of those. I also put over there the nonfiction, and you see that link all the way at the bottom back to her father. One of the interesting things about a context is that there's crossing links between people and ideas, and that's part of the richness that we make those connections. Her father was very committed to the idea that when you read an author, you should know as much as you could about their life. And so he had that sort of biography approach, and she really picked that up from her father. And so she read a lot of biographies, biographical materials, and she would bring those into her book reviews, actually. And read a lot of history, all kinds of things. In the middle of that diagram, I put self and society. Of course, it starts with herself and her own life. And then just put there a few people who were really important to her. Her father, in a lot of ways, she was his a follower or protege, and she was sort of carrying on some of what he was already doing. Her mother, Virginia Woolf, is someone whose mother died when she was 13 years old. It's probably the most important emotional experience of her entire life is when that happened. Her mother was very, very important to her, and her great book, To the Lighthouse, is really about her mother more than anything else. Her sister, Vanessa, also very important to her. Other siblings, also important. Leonard Woolf, her husband, very important in supporting her work. The whole Bloomsbury group with lots of interesting people who had a lot of current ideas about art and literature and society that she was learning from. And of course, lots and lots of other people. She was a very sociable person. She would have known hundreds of people. Her diary, which is a fascinating account of her life, she just every day she's talking about people she meets and dinner parties and all kinds of things. So very rich there. Finally, on the far side, I put places, also important to her work and her life. In fact, the biography that Hermione Lee wrote of Virginia Woolf, which is a good biography, the first chapter is called Houses, and it's all about the places that she grew up. That's how important that was to her, where she lived. Also, nature was important, and she traveled. That was also important to her. So that was also a rich part. So that's a schematic if you want to break down her context into some categories. And there's some crosses between them. But the actual context would dive way, way down and would have thousands and thousands of elements, right? All the people, the places, the books, very rich. And she'd be building up connections between them. And that would really be her context. And then in that rich context that she had to find a way to find her creative voice. And so in a way, that's what I see as the challenge for a lot of creative, innovative work, is you have all this rich experience and knowledge, and how do you find your own true voice to come up with something creative and innovative within that context? That's really what she was working to do. So that's the challenge of creativity. How do we approach being creative in these kinds of large-scale network contexts? Randomly trying different things isn't likely to work. There's just too many options. You can't just randomly try everything. Virginia Woolf could not write about everything and anything. It took a lot of work to write even a short story for her. Hard to find a needle in a haystack. How are you going to look for it? So the key in this rich world that we live in, the key is guidance. The key is context for creativity are large scale, and we use guidance to find our way to outstanding creative outcomes. So it's kind of a process of thinking our way forward to where are the potentially creative, rich places to look. I'm going to give you some examples to make that point. But first, I'm going to tell you a little more about what I mean, by guidance before we get to the stories. Guidance is higher level conceptual thinking that provides guidance into the thicket of possibilities. So you're going down into a thicket where there's so many options, and the guidance is going to help you see where you want to go, more or less. Kind of like, I think of it as like a map or a guide to where you're going to go to. I think from the point of view of organizations and managing creativity and innovation, that's a super important way to think about it, that you're trying to provide some guidance to people who are doing creative work for you to help them go in the directions that will be productive for what they're doing. So I definitely want that to be a takeaway if you're interested in managing creativity. That's an important takeaway, I think, is that's how you should think about it. I've worked, and in the book, I've put together a framework for how this happens, which I'm just going to sketch for you in like 10 minutes or so, very quickly. You could go to the book and get a lot more detail about it. But there's guiding conceptions and there's guiding principles. And those two actually work together. So when you look at creative people, you find they have both, like Virginia Woolf, and they bring them together, and that's how they actually create, or it's one of the ways that they create. Just want to say before I jump into that, I was giving this, talking to some people about this back in the spring, and we're just talking about it. This is kind of an American sign, I guess, a bend in the road. I don't know if in China you would use a sign, road sign like that, but I think we're at a time right now where there's a new approach to modeling and understanding creativity and innovation that can develop for us. I think it relates a little bit to AI, although it's not exactly the same, but it's a little bit related. And just to say a bit more about that, creativity, innovation related to it has really been centered in the field of psychology for a long time. And they've made some great contributions in psychology to help us understand creative personality and some, creative experience that people have and those sorts of things. But it's a different discipline, and I come at this more from the point of view of modeling, social science, networks, and I think it's a time to study creativity differently as happening in this richer context rather than the very simplified context that I think has traditionally been the way creativity has been thought about. So it's an opportunity really to use the models, the tools we have available to model the creative, innovative process in a richer way. If you look right now today, for example, in pharmaceutical industry, you'll see that they're already using AI in ways that fit with what I'm telling you right here. I don't think that they're consciously describing the model quite the way I'm going to, but I think they're already doing it. So I think that we're moving to this bend where we're going to start to think about it differently and understand the challenges differently for it. Okay, so what do I mean by guided conception? Well, it's going to help individual and teams navigate the rich landscape of possibilities. And here's what I want you to do with the guiding conception. Imagine what you would like to create. It's really that simple. Someone thinking a little more freely, a little more openly, can imagine what they would love to create. Could be a goal, could be a question they want to answer, could be a theme, could just be possibilities. And once you have that guiding conception, that sort of open, imagined vision for what you would like to do, even if you don't know how to do it right now, that's a great first step. Because once you have that, you can generate seed project ideas. And from those seed project ideas, bigger, successful projects can develop. So it's like a vision in a way. I think of it as a little bit behind the scenes creativity, because it's not the actual thing somebody did. It's a little bit step back and say, well, before they did what they did, what were they thinking they wanted to do, right? Because once you think you want to do something, you're able to visualize it, then you get started on the journey. And then, of course, things will happen, and you'll see where you finally end up. We won't do this today, but when I teach this, and I just did a workshop 2 weeks ago down in Australia for this, I love to have students or participants spend some time writing down for themselves their own guiding conception. I think that's a really interesting exercise. What is the guiding conception you would have for something you would love to create? Just don't worry about whether it's possible. Just think about what would you love to create. And then it's actually great to discuss that, sometimes put people in small groups and talk between themselves about their different guiding conceptions and see where that conversation leads. So it's a great teaching tool to use. Second piece of this is guiding principles. So they are used to evaluate ideas, and then they're used to guide projects. They rule out what doesn't fit, like lacks balance or some harmony that you think you want. Especially interesting to me is the guiding principles are used creatively to find key missing pieces so a project comes together. So once you have a seed project, that's not enough. It's a good start. But now you've got to find the extra missing pieces that bring into the seed to make it into a whole project that works. That's how I think about it. On the right there, I put that, I found that from Shel Silverstein's little book he wrote, a children's book called The Missing Piece. And it was missing a piece and it was not happy. So it goes on a search to find the piece it's missing, set off in search of the missing piece. But in the end, the correct piece is not what it expects to find, interestingly. Turns out that the piece it really wants is that little butterfly just sitting on its nose. That's the missing piece, which it did not realize until the end of its journey. But that's creativity, right? The missing piece is also creative and adds to you to make the whole project, okay? So the two work together. The guiding conception visualizes, imagines, and then once you start with a seed, the guiding principle helps you find the missing pieces so it all works. Talking about guiding principles, Steve Jobs, a great example of someone who really had some very strong guiding principles. For him, we would call them design principles, which are an example of a guiding principle. He would reject many solutions that his team proposed. His favorite word was like, no, that isn't good enough, do it again. But he was also very creative in the way he used guiding principles to make projects work. And there's a story that's told that they were working on a computer design and he was not happy with it. And he went out one weekend and he went to a shopping center, actually near to where I grew up, and I learned that Carol also was there, Stanford Shopping Center, so she at least will know that. But anyway, he goes into a department store and he sees a Cuisinart, which is a kitchen appliance. And he thought, wow, the curvature, the way it was shaped was perfect. So he goes back to his team and he says, you see this Cuisinart, I want you to design the computer so it looks like the Cuisinart. And that's what they did, actually, and that was the creative link he made. So always thinking with his guiding principles, And those creative links, that was the missing piece that enabled the design to work so the computer came together. Really interesting. So just to summarize, all of which, that the guiding conceptions and guiding principles act in concert together. The guiding conception, the vision, generates the seeds. An example of that, the very simplest example would be in your rich context, you find two elements that have not been connected before, but you imagine a way to connect them. That would be the simplest possible example, a new creative connection. And then the guiding principles evaluate the seeds, and if the seed is pursued, help identify critical third element to make the project come together. And that could be anywhere in your context. The Cuisinart was way out there somewhere, but Steve Jobs found it and brought it in. So that is, in a nutshell, on that slide right there, that is the way this framework works. Okay. Go again to the book for more about that. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to give you some examples because I think it'll be a little more exciting to see some people actually did it. So let's do that. First of all, Jack Dorsey and the founding of Twitter. That's now called X, but Twitter when it was founded. That picture you see there is actually a memo pad where supposedly Steve Jobs, that's the first time he jotted out some notes for what would become Twitter, actually on that memo pad. And you see that box there in the middle of the memo pad? See this box right here? He kind of carved it out here. His idea from the very beginning with Twitter was you would send short messages. He thought to your friends or your friend group, it would have to be very short. So he wrote the box to make sure that your message could not be too long. That was his original idea. And then below that line, you see where it says in bed, it says going to the park. His original idea was this would be a way to let my friends know exactly what I'm doing right now. And it would have to be really short little bursts of information. That's interesting from 2 points of view for me. One is, this is an example of something, social media, we have so many things today, but if this person hadn't had this conception, I'm not sure we would have something like Twitter today. Twitter or X is kind of unusual in a lot of ways. And I think it's because this person had this guiding conception for these short bursts of information that's what eventually led to Twitter. And then the other thing is, of course, Twitter went way beyond what Jack Dorsey thought it was going to be, because once you have a creative innovation, the world gets a hold of it and can do anything with it, and you can't really control that process. So it's used for many things today. He thought it would be just letting your friends know about what you're doing, but obviously today it's used for many, many other things. That's just what happens. Well, what's the story about that? There was an article on him in the Los Angeles Times. Twitter didn't just fly out of thin air and land on a branch. As Dorsey explains, it has conceptual roots in the world of vehicle dispatch, where cars and bikes zooming around town must constantly squawk to each other about where they are and what they're up to. Interestingly, that the origins of Twitter, the original concept, actually goes back to Jack Dorsey growing up in a city. And in particular, he grew up in St. Louis in the United States, and he had a fascination with city life, especially with all the people moving around the city. And of course, your incredible city here, we see the same thing, right? In fact, the bicycles have already almost been run over by bikes and cars and motorcycles in my first 24 hours here. So I can appreciate there's a lot of movement in the city. And he was also fascinated by the bicycle messengers, the dispatchers, the taxi cabs, the emergency vehicles moving all around. But he was especially interested in how they would be sending real-time information about local conditions back to their central dispatcher. For example, a taxi cab is going around and there's a big traffic jam on a certain corner in the city because maybe an accident. And so the taxi cab would send back to their dispatcher, there's an accident here, send all of your vehicles a different way around because you shouldn't go through this part of the city. He was just interested in how that was happening in real time in the city. Now, something that's interesting about that is unless you really know a lot about the origins of Twitter, before you walked in the room this afternoon, you would never have imagined that that was the beginnings of Twitter. Was somebody growing up in a city interested in bicycles and taxi cabs moving around the city? What does that have to do with Twitter? You would never imagine that. But it's a great example of these creative paths that people follow, that's actually where it started. Jack Dorsey became a programmer and was doing stuff. If I had to summarize his guiding conception, this would be it. Information dispatches in city environments to friends that have to be real time, right now, mobile. So as you're moving around the city, you can do it, and short bursts of information. Well, he had that idea, I think for quite a few years, he didn't really know what to do with that. Around 2000, there was something called instant messaging on computers. He tried it, but it failed. He'd like go to a restaurant, come home a few hours later and send a message to his friends, hey, I went to this great restaurant tonight. His friends did not seem to be too interested that he had gone to a restaurant 3 hours before. It wasn't immediate enough. It wasn't real time enough for them to be interested. He also tried a primitive email device at that time. Hardly anybody was using it. But you know what? We learned from failure. One of the sort of guiding rules we have about creativity and innovation is that it's when you fail, you learn, and that's okay, perfectly fine. So he learned. But a few years later, he was working in San Francisco for a company called Odeo, and that company actually was failing. And so they asked their teams to brainstorm business ideas. And he brought up his idea to his team at that time. And he said, what if we develop a device that would enable people to send short information bursts to their friends, where you are, what's new, stuff like that. And the team liked it, and that was when Twitter was born, about 2005, 2006. One thing to notice about that is that right at that time, the earliest smartphones, cell phones, had just been developed. And Jack Dorsey, one of his guiding principles is he's kind of what we call a minimalist. He likes things really short, simple, very basic. And he said when he saw that cell phone technology, he thought, this is perfect. It's going to be cheap. Everybody's going to have access. It's going to fit perfectly with my idea for Twitter because you could use it to send short text messages to your friends. So to me, I'd say that was really where the guiding principle kicked in. And he found that third piece, which was the new technology that had emerged and could bring it together with his idea. And that's how Twitter was born, really. So guiding conception, and then the key third element was the smartphones. And his minimalist design, his guiding principle, his brevity fit with the smartphone interface. It was just perfect for him. In a way, he had to wait for a technology to appear that fit with his idea. And that was what he was able to see that and see the value of fitting it with his idea. And that's how Twitter came about. Okay. All right, that's Jack Dorsey. I'm going to do two more people as examples for you and then just talk a little bit about management of creativity to wrap up this talk. Virginia Woolf, let's talk about her for a few minutes, a writer. I showed you earlier, this is her context. This is sort of the top of it. The actual context, of course, had so much that she had read and learned, places she had traveled. We know a lot about Virginia Woolf's creative development because she left us so much material. She kept a diary, which is really fascinating. She wrote a lot of letters, other journals, wrote a lot of essays. So we can see a lot about her path of development. We can't see that with everybody. A lot of creative people wouldn't necessarily have left that to us. As I mentioned, her mother died when she was 13. Her father died a few years later. Her older brother, Toby, also died. That experience of loss is really at the center of her greatest work, I would say, how she had to deal with that. So that's an example of a very deep part of her psychological experience that played a big role in what she did. So in 1917, at the age of 35, while she was working on her second novel, Night and Day, Virginia gave herself a break. I think that second novel was getting to be kind of hard work. She was a little tired of it. She gave herself a break. And all in a flash, as she said, she wrote a short story called The Mark on the Wall. By the way, before I jump that, just to fill this in, I'm a professor, so I like to connect all the dots. We can never connect all the dots, but we're trying to connect whatever dots we can. Virginia Woolf wanted to be a writer from the age of probably 6, okay? And she did not have this insight I'm about to share with you until she was 35. So it gives you some idea of the path of creativity can be a long one. And I often think with creativity that the people who make it, who are able to contribute with creativity and innovation, it's partly about the people who can withstand the journey and go through this journey. You have to be very committed to the journey because it can be a long journey. And it really was for her. So in the middle of this story, the Mark on the Wall, this is what she wrote. As we face each other in omnibuses and underground railways, we are looking into the mirror. And the novelists in future will realize more and more the importance of these reflections. For of course, there is not one reflection, but an almost infinite number. Those are the depths they will explore, those the phantoms they will pursue, leaving the description of reality more and more out of their stories. That's what she wrote. You can go back and read the short story to get more of the richness of what she's thinking about there, but I would say this paragraph is probably it's right in the center of the story, probably the most important. What is she really talking about? Reflections, what she means is people thinking about other people or making comments about other people. So how do other people view us? How do we view them? How are we talking about each other? Those are the reflections we live with every day. And it's interesting that there's not just one reflection, but an almost infinite number, because as we go through our lives, every day we're experiencing these reflections. And so over many days, it's just a lot of reflections. And that relates to Virginia Woolf's interest from early on, which was in the context in biography. She really wanted to understand the life path. And we can see that in some earlier things she wrote in some of her journals. And so when she had the idea of reflections, she immediately connected it to the idea of biography to see, well, it's a whole infinite series of reflections. Also interesting at the last part there, she wants to leave the description of reality more and more out of the stories, okay? That's actually very important here too, because Virginia Woolf, for a long time, she was trying to push back on really the world of her father and the world of Victorian literature like Charles Dickens, which was very heavy description, and she didn't want to do that anymore. Actually, when I think about her, I think of that as more of a guiding principle for her, that she wanted to leave reality out. She always used that to check herself as she was writing stories. Is there too much reality in here? Too much description? I don't want that. I want to not have that because I'm trying to get away from what was done in the past. Very important part of what she was doing. So that was her guiding conception. And then in the following 2.5 years, Virginia Woolf wrote a series of short stories exploring different kinds of reflections and narrative styles. She was trying to figure out how to do this and was not that easy. These were like little projects that didn't quite work, but she learned every time she did it. So for example, Kew Gardens, a snail is a protagonist just creeping along. We see the world from his perspective, and we have a series of couples stroll by and we hear snippets of their conversation. So like reflections of what they're talking about is what we hear. The Evening Party, another short story. The protagonist enters the house where the party is happening and gazes into a mirror and finds something has dissolved my face. It's really the breakdown of self and objectivity that's shown in that story. So she's trying to find her way to get away from reality and just focus on the reflections. Well, the breakthrough for her came in a story she wrote, which has a funny name. It's called An Unwritten Novel. And in this story, the narrator is sitting on a moving train, and her attention is drawn to a passenger sitting opposite her. And on the fly, the narrator gives that passenger a name, Minnie, and then she imagines Minnie's life. And other characters' opinions of Minnie fill the story, so she really has people in the story thinking about Minnie from different perspectives. And what happens in that story is that a free-flowing style emerges that really was new for Virginia Woolf. We don't know exactly how she came up with that story idea, but I think it's possible it actually came to her while she was riding on a train, because on the train, the sense of movement is very powerful, and the passengers coming on and off the train, I think kind of that's what that story picks up on, interestingly. So just after writing this story, Virginia wrote in her diary of having arrived at some idea of a new form for a new novel. So she realized right away that she had hit on the way to go forward with her writing. And I think that is part of creativity also, is to recognize the insight when you have it. And she did. And she wrote, suppose one thing should open out of another. Doesn't that get closer and yet keep form and speed and enclose everything? The approach will be entirely different this time. No scaffolding, scarcely a brick to be seen. Then I'll find room for so much, a gaiety, an inconsequence, a light-spirited stepping at my sweet will. No scaffolding, scarcely a brick to be seen. That is, no heavy description of reality, none of that. Just a character's life shown in little snippets of conversation and people thinking about the character. And a sense of being free to move quickly in the story from one thing to another, because you don't have that heaviness weighing you down. Just move from one reflection to the next. That's what she was doing. So once she had that insight, then she was off and in what we think of today as her great modern writing. Right away, she began work on her novel, Jacob's Room. Then it was followed by Mrs. Dalloway. I think everyone's heard of that novel for various reasons that she wrote. And then that great creative period culminated in To the Lighthouse. Mrs. Ramsay is the central figure in that novel, modeled very much on Virginia's mother. She's at the center, and we hear other characters thinking about her and her thinking about them. The whole story of To the Lighthouse is really about reflections in a lot of ways. I could say more about that, but in the interest of time, I'm definitely not going to, because we're going to keep moving. But that's a little bit of a snapshot of what she went through, guiding conception, leaving reality out, and then coming to her ideas. Let's talk about one more person before we read our examples, Albert Einstein. He's left us some knowledge of what he went through, not as much as Virginia Woolf, but a lot of great scholars have studied Albert Einstein and his work, and we've really benefited from what they have done to understand what his creative path was. By the way, on the left, that's sort of a picture everyone's seen of Albert Einstein probably. On the right, that's a picture of Albert Einstein actually at the time he developed the theory of special relativity. I think there's some insight just in those two photographs, because on the right, he just looks like what everyone, a professional in that world, European world at that time, about 100 years ago, that's what they looked like. Everybody dressed like that. He didn't stand out at all. On the left, okay, over here, he literally let his hair down, didn't he? And because once you do what he did, you could do whatever you like. That's kind of misleading. It's like rock stars who look weird, right? That's great. But the thing is, that's a little misleading, because at the time Albert Einstein did the great creative breakthroughs, he looked just like everybody else looks. And I think rock stars can look all weird, but actually they work super hard to do what they're doing. There's a method to their madness, to what they do, the lifestyle that they have. That's what I think. So there's a message in that. How did his story go? Einstein conceived a paradox at the age of 16. And this is what he said it was. If I pursue a beam of light with the velocity of c, which is the velocity of light in a vacuum, I should observe such a beam of light as a spatially oscillatory electromagnetic field at rest. However, there seems to be no such thing whether on the basis of experience or according to Maxwell's equations. All right, that's kind of a handful, right? Actually, it's not that complicated. Just think about you're driving on a freeway and there's a car right in front of you that's going, really fast, and you're driving right behind the car. Well, if the car is going fast and you're going the same speed right behind it, you're moving the same speed as the car. It doesn't really look like it's moving at all relative to you, right? It's staying the same distance ahead of you as you move. That's what that means to say. And of course, Maxwell in his equation said, well, light, it's like turn on a flashlight, boom, the beam of light goes out at a super high speed, c. And it sees electromagnetic fields that are beeping on and off as it moves down. It's just going like this, moving. But if you were traveling right behind it, you would see that as if it wasn't moving at all. You'd be going the same speed as that light, that beam of light, and it wouldn't look like it was moving at all. That's actually what that says. But they realized, even at that time, when he came up with the paradox, there had been some early experiments, and people realized that didn't seem to be possible. For example, when you looked at a beam of light going with the rotation of the Earth or against the rotation of Earth, didn't seem to make any difference. It always seemed to move at the same speed. So that was kind of the paradox he hit on, really coming out of Maxwell's equations, which was kind of his big interest at that time. And by the way, this is a picture of Albert Einstein around the age of 15. He's really just a cute boy, okay? He just happened, obviously very passionate about physics, he just happened to come up with this paradox, this idea. If he had not come up with that paradox, his life might have gone in very different directions than it went. But he did come up with that at the age of 16. So what happened after that was a long period of creative exploration. Starting from the paradox, Einstein first explored in physics, but he really did not find the answer there. He looked at a lot of different kinds of physics. Planck's quantum theory is something that he knew, and I think he got from that it was okay to challenge the existing ways of thinking, thermodynamics. We know from his notes that there were many attempts he made to solve the paradox that he didn't think worked, and he threw them out over quite a few years. I think when he first came up with the paradox, he probably thought, oh, this is fine, I'll just figure this out, and no big deal. But as the years went by and he could not figure it out, he began to realize this is a big deal. How do I solve this paradox? But he did not give up. And in fact, he was determined and patient. In fact, someone asked him, what qualities do you have that enabled you to make the discoveries or inventions that you did? What he said was, when I had a question, I did not stop until I found an answer I was fully satisfied with. That's what he said, which is interesting. He was very determined, and he would not accept an answer that he did not think worked, which I'll come back to in a minute. So after doing the physics, he kind of shifted a little bit to a little more philosophy. Started probably with Newton's conception of absolute time. He had been exposed to ideas of Ernest Mach in college, who was very critical of an idea that there's something called absolute time. Now he was working in the patent office in Bern, and in his spare time, Einstein forms what he called the Olympia Academy with a few friends, and they read many works in philosophy. We actually know what they read because they kept a list of what they read. In fact, the first thing they read was Plato, interestingly, and they read a lot of other things. It really was just a reading group. Shows a lot of dedication, doesn't it? He's working full time and did all of this just in the evenings and on the weekends, and also had a small child at that time. So a very busy person. But it's a great example of the evolution or broadening of a guiding conception to start from a paradox and realize, wow, really I have to go over here to these philosophical ideas if I'm going to solve this paradox. Eventually, he was led to David Hume's, I think I didn't say that. He was led ultimately to David Hume's Treatise of Human Nature. And that was really how he resolved this paradox. Hume argues we have no conception of how much time passes apart from definite sequences of events or changes of state. Hume argued we measure time as one sequence of events in relation to a second sequence, such as the second hand on a clock goes all the way around, and we say, oh, I've been talking for 1 minute. All it is we measure one event, how long has this professor been talking, in relation to another series of events, which is a clock, that clock right there on the wall. It's just one thing in relation to another thing. That's what it means to measure time. And the thing about that is time is defined constructively. We construct the measure of time. That's actually all David Hume, very brilliant philosopher, 200 years before Albert Einstein, he wrote that. But nobody had made this connection before. So after what he described as years of groping, actually 10 years of searching, Einstein connected Hume's approach with the paradox and electrodynamics of moving bodies. And this is as he later recounted it. He was speaking with Michel Besso, his close friend, in Bern. This is what he said. Then suddenly I understood where the key to this problem lay. The next day we met again. Without even greeting him, I said, thank you, I've completely solved the problem. An analysis of the concept of time was my solution. Time cannot be absolutely defined, and there is an inseparable relation between time and signal velocity. So he really connected it to Hume. I won't go through the physics. Actually, in my class, I do a little picture to show why this is true. It actually is very, very simple. But we won't do that on a Sunday afternoon for you. But there's two things that are interesting about what he said there. Number one is there really was a dramatic moment. He's working on this thing, this paradox for 10 years, and then suddenly he sees the answer. So the dramatic moments happen, but if I just told you that moment, it would be kind of meaningless, because behind that moment was the original paradox at 16, and then all those years of searching and then reading philosophy and finally David Hume, where he finally made the connection. That's how it actually happened. Second point is, interestingly, he had this insight, one of the two greatest insights probably of his life in physics, while he was talking to his close friend, actually his closest friend as an adult, Michel Besso. And we often think of Einstein as pretty much of a loner, a lone thinker, which he was. He loved to sail, spent a lot of time thinking. But interestingly, this idea happened while he was talking with his friend. So I think there's a lesson in that. It's very good to have someone to talk to about your ideas, a mentor, a friend, whatever it might be. Really, for him, turned out it was important to have somebody to talk to about it, just give him that chance to express his own ideas. All right, this is somebody who wrote about this, that David Hume was the key connection. I think we'll leave that alone in the interest of time here. Albert Einstein's guiding principle was relativity, or what we call the principle of relativity. And what's interesting is he was very strict in his application of this principle. More or less said, doesn't matter what your frame of reference is, physics and the way physics happens has to be the same for everybody. That was his rule. That was the guiding principle. And interestingly, at that time, there were people solving physics problems where people in different frames of reference were actually using physics. The laws of physics were different for them. And Einstein said he could not stand that. He felt that it had to be very strictly applied. It was always the same. So he rejected many potential solutions that did not fit, would not stop until he found an answer that satisfied him. The creative link was to Hume. And then he also did some great thought experiments to come up with general relativity. We could talk about that later if you want, but I won't do it right this minute. But in his little book about relativity theory, which Einstein published right after the general theory, the whole book is about the principle of relativity and the strictness of which you have to apply it in these different situations. So he's really committed. That does remind me a little bit of Steve Jobs, I think, two individuals who had guiding principles they were very, very committed to. And so they would require those to hold or use them in ways that other people really didn't, because other people were not as committed to them. So something else I love to do in organizations is have people articulate what are your guiding principles, or what are our guiding principles as an organization. That's very important, for creative work in particular, to do that. It isn't always as clearly articulated as Steve Jobs understood it to be or Albert Einstein did. All right, that brings me to the last part here, which is let's talk about some managerial implications. Real quick, because I'm aware of the time here. I want to leave some time for questions for sure. Number one, manage the process, okay? That's the first thing I tell organizations when they bring me in to do a workshop around creativity and innovation. It's a process, manage it as a process. Individual and team paths, you should think about what those are. What is the learning? What are the projects? Being reflective, looking back over what the learning journeys have been is really important. Organizations that do a good job, like Pixar or Apple at times, they do that. Most organizations, even today, they don't do it. So then they don't really pick up on what are the patterns, how is creativity happening for us. Building your context. We talked all about context. If Albert Einstein hadn't gone out and read David Hume, I'm not sure he would have made that creative link, ever solved that paradox. So helping to build the context and extending it in ways that are going to be fruitful, that's really up to the managers in a lot of ways, right? To help guide people to build a context where those connections could happen. Within the organization, the culture is important, openness, support for exploring and trying and failing, because both Virginia Woolf and Albert Einstein and Jack Dorsey, all three of them, there were many failures along the way. Mentoring, I think, is super important. Again, we saw with Albert Einstein, talking to his friend was the key moment. So helping to support those conversations seems important. The third one is dealing with creative blockages. That's a whole separate topic. We could do a whole workshop, discussion just about that. I'll have students come to me in my class and say, I'm taking this class because I'm not a creative person. And then I say, well, everybody can be creative, every single person. And if somebody isn't being creative, the better way to think about it is, what is stopping them? Like, what is preventing them from being creative? Let's find the blockage, and then we can help them work to improve on that particular part of the process. So managers, you should always be thinking in those terms. I think about what are the blocks, how do we improve them? Lots of exercises that you can do around that topic. Something I like to do, ask employees to articulate guiding conceptions, and then discuss, because there's creativity in the overlaps between different people's guiding conceptions, and there's also creativity in the differences between them. So either way, you benefit and you learn, and you might find some new creative connections and ideas to explore. And you should also articulate and discuss guiding principles, because those are the things, as we saw, that are really important in making a project finally work, in solving your problems. One thing I do in my class is we talk about some outstanding organizations like Pixar, Steve Jobs at Apple, SpaceX. These three organizations are very innovative. They articulate and structure their process. But then we have students talk about their own work experience in companies they've worked in. And man, there's a big, big difference. Most organizations, different industries, often smaller, they have not structured the process. Ideas are lost. There's disagreements, lack of organizational memory. It's just kind of like this chaotic situation. So there's a lot to be learned by comparing different organizations and how they go about working with creativity, I would say. Finally, just mention AI and creativity. AI is on a lot of people's minds, of course. We could talk about this a lot, but two things I'll mention about it in relation to what I do. First thing is, each person's context is unique. Okay, I've kind of showed you that a little bit today. AI is funny. The modern AI, like the ChatGPT, it's actually a common data pool. And so to actually get to an individual's creative potential, what are you going to have to do with that common, huge, vast amount of information? You're going to have to subtract a lot. I mean, really a lot, because that person doesn't know most of what's in there. And then you have to add back the special parts of that person's context that are not in there because they're not part of the internet world. Like for Virginia Woolf, the experience of her loss of her mother and how that would feel, that's something very personal. So you really have to subtract a lot and add back in to get closer to a representation of a particular person's context. And of course, there's a lot of role of intuition for the guidance, for the guiding conceptions. Second thing I find interesting with AI is that there's such a rush to completion because AI, these programs just generate something so fast, don't they? Which is really fun. But I've also learned working with students is that you kind of have to slow down to allow the partially formed, half-baked ideas to be explored more and developed creatively. I mean, that's really where the guiding principles come in to help you find the correct missing piece. That takes some time. So in terms of the human-computer interface, which is very important here, we kind of have to slow the computer part. We have to work it out so the human time frame is relevant to the process to allow the human creativity to be brought into the process, I would say. All right, what's next? I mean, really, what's next for me, what I'm doing, what's next for the world would be all kinds of things. Let's wrap up with this. This is painting by Vanessa Lemon. She's a Southern California artist. It's called Holding On and Letting Go. And she wrote about this painting. She was a transformation manifested. I like that phrase. I'm really interested in modeling the life journeys that happen. Each person follows a unique life path. And creativity happens when a person's life path intersects creatively with their field and their culture, and they get the opportunities to sort of make those connections. So to me, it's about modeling the life path and developing that inner world of experiences and knowledge and what's important, like guiding principles, and modeling how it intersects with opportunities in the field and the culture. That kind of connection is, I think, where the individual contributes to their field and their culture. And we have so much more to do in learning more about that and understanding how individuals make those contributions. So thank you so much. It's been my pleasure to talk to you this afternoon.
Thank you so much, Professor Feinstein.